And you're listening to Radio France International. It's just coming up to 10 to the hour. Time now for our special guest. Well, around the world, there are millions of children who don't go to school, and they don't go to school for all sorts of reasons. A free education is just not available to everyone in many countries. Sometimes schools which exist don't deliver much of an education either. Buildings can be unsuitable. There might not be enough teachers. Sometimes there's no transport to get children into classrooms, or children might be kept home by their parents who need them to work. But the problem of corruption in the education sector often lies behind these stories. And that's why Unesco and the IIEP, which is a body which examines research on issues to do with education, they've been looking at the question of corruption in education provision. And I'm joined now by Muriel Poisson, who's the author of this IIEP report. First of all, Muriel, can you give us an idea, what kind of corruption are we talking about? Give us some examples.
Well, there are many different forms that corruption can take within the education sector. I can just share with you a few examples. One, for instance, has to do with the funding of schools, funding of universities. There was a survey that was conducted a few years ago in Burkina Faso that showed that there was only about 90% of the resources that were supposed to go to the schools that actually reached the schools. And for specific resources like textbooks, this could go up to 35 or 60%, for instance. So this is one example as regards finance. And another example has to do more with teachers. And there is one phenomenon that we call ghost teachers. So ghost teachers are people that are listed officially on the payroll, but who do not teach. Sometimes they do not exist, but someone is taking the salary. Sometimes they do exist, but they do not teach. And again, there were some research work conducting in countries like Uganda, for instance, a few years ago, that showed that it can be 15 to up to 20% of all the teachers that can be ghost teachers, which obviously represent quite an important amount of resources. There is also the whole domain of contracting, school construction, school equipment, school repair. Here I can take an example from another region, in this case from Indonesia, where there was a huge programs funded by the international community to repair and to reconstruct a number of schools. And it turned out that, well, part of the resources for the constructions were captured by people at local level. And it's about 30% of the overall resources that disappeared in this case. There is also, for instance, the issue of bribery of parents, for instance, that need to pay bribes for the kids to be admitted to schools or university, even though public education is supposed to be free of charge.
In what sort of countries might that happen?
And I must say it can be, I would say, in most developing and countries in transition. And recently, for instance, I'm just back from Serbia, from a mission, and still this issue of paying bribery to have access to a number of services within the education sector is extremely high in the system. Gosh. This can be for admission, to obtain some certificates, to have access to specific programs within the schools and so on.
What sort of cost are we talking about? So you're talking about kickbacks, embezzlement, in all these different countries. If that money were to be spent on children's education, what sort of sum are we talking about?
Well, there are not real estimate of the overall cost of corruption in the education sector, because there is no, at the moment, international survey that enable really to make good comparisons between countries to get a figure and to compare countries to countries. But still we have figures. For instance, if we talk about this example from Burkina Faso that I was mentioning to you, they said that those leakage of funds represented something like 2.4 billion francs CFA, which makes around 5 million of US dollars. If we talk about those ghost teachers in Uganda, it's something like 2.8 billion per year.
Right, so it's on a huge scale.
And it's not only wastage of resources, but also it has to do with the type and the quality of the learning that is being provided. And there is another work that shows that, for instance, in Brazil, the levels reached by the students in math and in Portuguese, it's much lower in corrupt environment compared to other places where there is less corruption.
No doubt. So what can be done to sort this problem out?
So in terms of strategies, ourselves at IIEP, we have documented cases of countries that have tried to improve transparency, accountability in those different domains. One major conclusion is that you need to make the norms and the procedures more transparent and more easy for people to understand. People should understand, well, on what basis resources are allocated to the schools. When a new teacher is recruited, people should know on what are the criteria for recruiting the staff. For admission to universities, people should know exactly, and this should be made public, what are the requirements. So that's one thing. The second thing is to build capacities, and including of the administration, of ministries of education, of local authorities, of people working at school level, in accounting, in audit, and in different domains, because corruption sometimes is also quite close to low governance and weak governance within the system. And this is one of the things that we are doing at our institute, is to train especially government officials, to help them make a good mapping of what are the risks within the systems, to know better what are the tools that they can use to assess the magnitude of these problems, and also to learn from experiences from other countries, neighboring countries, or countries from other regions, to try to tackle these issues. And so ourselves, for instance, we conducted training in countries like DRC, like Sierra Leone, like Mali, and many other countries. And yet the last strategy that we consider is important is to provide public access to information, and also for the systems to share more information, for instance, about the schools, and to provide school data. And we see in many countries, in Bangladesh, in Indonesia, in Philippines, but also in Uganda, in Ghana, and in other countries, more and more school data are made available to the public on the school budget, on the number of teachers that are allocated to one school. And once parents get the information, then if they don't receive the adequate number of teachers, adequate resources, adequate number of textbooks, then they can ask for it and claim for it. So that's another axis of our work.
Is there much difference between education delivered by private organisations and education delivered by publicly run schools? Is corruption rife in both? Or?
Yeah, you can, of course, have also corruption in the public sector, and in different ways, in a way also that can pervade the public sector, because sometimes the private sector, they use the teachers from the public sector, while the teachers from the public sector are supposed to be teaching in the public schools at the same time. Or sometimes they receive some public subsidies from the governments to operate, and then they use it, for the private use, to buy a car of whatever. And at the same time, they can also be corruption, for instance, as regards contracting and the building of the private school. So obviously there is also corruption in the private sector.
So are there any success stories where corruption has been successfully stamped out?
There is an example that is often mentioned, which is that of Uganda, which conducting a tracking survey to identify the leakage of resources in the system. And based on that, they decided to publish the amounts that are allocated to the schools, to publish it in the daily newspapers, to publish this information through the radio, and also making compulsory for the schools to put this information on the entrance gate of the schools for everyone and for the parents to see this information. And based on that, to try to promote social control about what's happening with the resources allocated to education. And so they conducted another survey of the size a few years later, and they were able to show that after this information campaign, the rate of leakage had reduced quite in a very significant way.
Well, thank you very much. It's interesting, and I don't think fully understood quite how much of an impact corruption behind the scenes is having on ordinary children's lives.
And impact on terms of wastage, in terms of access, of quality, of equity.
Well, thank you very much for coming to talk to us. That was Muriel Poisson, who is looking into education, corruption in education, with an institute working closely with UNESCO.